because I'm an academic, you know. But I was fascinated by it. Yeah, John Sinclair was so good to see him here at the party. I'm glad we got a little piece we can show of him, because I really like him.
He's great. He's the best.
Welcome very much to Conversations. Well, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program two gentlemen. We're going to talk about rock and roll and so forth. There's a book that we want to let people know about that's come out by recently by one of them. But if I may, on my far left is Giorgio Gomelsky, and Giorgio Gomelsky is a music producer, and a person who's been involved in the popular music scene in a very seminal and right at the core kind of way for a very long period of time on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Giorgio Gomelsky to Conversations, and I do so here now, Giorgio. Welcome you very much. And he's a producer also of a program on Manhattan Network, so he's a long-term access and producer, and one who follows the implications of the emerging communication technology in a very leading-edge kind of way, and it's a real pleasure to welcome him to the program. And if I may, on my immediate left is perhaps our primary guest would be John Strausbaugh, and he's written a book that's just out now, Verso Press, I think it's called. And let's see if you can take a look at what it would look like. Got a picture I can see in the background of, looks like Mick Jagger, but it's called Rock Till You Drop, and it's just out now, and we're going to be talking about this and other matters. And John, welcome very much to Conversations and to Manhattan Network.
Thanks, Harold.
Maybe you could share with us. I know you're editor or an editor at the New York Press, which is worth saying at the beginning, but you've written this book, and maybe you could give us the background, when it got started, when you got the idea, and then we could talk about rock and roll. And we are going to show a little piece of tape of the great poet John Sinclair.
A great piece of tape, too,
who appeared at a party in support of the book recently. But maybe we could share the background of the book.
It started at the press when Rolling Stone magazine was doing its 30th birthday celebrations, which seemed to take a year or two. They were feting themselves all over the place. Yeah. And my editor-in-chief, Russ Smith, and I were reflecting on how actually we found what Rolling Stone had become by its 30th birthday was really quite depressing. It had become this somnolent, corporate, nothing at all like what it had started out. We remember it from, I saw volume 1, probably number 3, and I think he saw volume 1, number 1. Back when it started in 1968.
68, right? Yeah.
So as you know, as guys our age, I'm 50 years old, so you know, I remember when Rolling Stone was Rolling Stone, which it hasn't been for quite a while.
That's an interesting theme we can touch on.
Yeah, and to me that developed into the theme of not just Rolling Stone, but rock and roll in general.
Exactly.
And what that has become over its 50 years now.
Yeah.
And as it is aged, and the people of my generation, the boomer rock audience, has aged with it. We've kind of dragged this art form along with us as we've aged. Yeah. So the book's one of the central themes of the book is me as a boomer, as a 50-year-old guy, ranting against
the state of affairs.
Yeah, what I call colostomy rock, or
colostomy rock. All right.
Geezer rock, as other people call it.
And it's not aging so gracefully in your view. That's the point you're trying to make.
Yes, it's not about. I mean, it's fine with me. I mean, Mick Jagger should live to be 120. That's fine. But I don't want to see him on stage doing Satisfaction when he's 120.
You've seen it already.
When he was 30, that was enough. He needs to stop doing it.
Oh, it's something we can talk about. And you both are interested in music. I'm not that directly connected. I like the Fugs out of the 1980s. And Fireside Theater and that kind of thing, but it was rock music. You said 50 years for rock, right?
Yeah, well, roughly.
Where does it come from? What's the music background? Is it coming out of the blues, out of gospel, out of where? Where does it come from?
Out of all those things.
And how do we mark its birthday if we can? If you said 50 years ago, I heard you say. So either one of you can jump in and fill me
Giorgio
and the audience in on the history of rock and roll itself.
It go depending on, there's different rock scholars and they have different theories, but you go back to the late 40s, early 50s, and things were happening with what was called jump music at that point, which jazz was becoming popularized by guys like Louis Jordan, and they were doing things with it that were kind of proto rock and roll. In the early 50s, it becomes what we recognize now as rock and roll. And that just keeps developing. It's jazz, it's blues, it's gospel. The best rock and roll is a mix of so many. There's country music in there, and that's the thing that Elvis does to it. Elvis and people like him. It wasn't just Elvis, obviously, but when those Southern white guys got involved with what had been largely, not exclusively, but largely various kinds of black music. sort of whipped them all together, added that hillbilly country twang thing to it that they did. So you get songs like Blue Suede Shoes and stuff like that.
Well, that's Presley.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at that point, I think you've got what we now understand as rock and roll.
Yeah.
And you can see all sorts of there's obvious it's got African
So
roots.
it doesn't have a definite. It's not definitely blues. It's not definitely.
No.
It's sort of an amalgam of all of those and so forth. But it's definitely.
And rhythm and blues and what was called race music in those days.
Well, that's what I was going to say. And the jazz and so forth. It was largely the music of our black denizens and citizens by and large, out of which rock and roll came, and then it crossed over into, let's say, crossover group into the suburbs of the white middle class groups and so forth with rock and roll, or was that crossing over before?
Well, white kids were always listening to jazz, and the sort of a kind of degraded popular jazz that white kids were dancing to in the post-war period. It was certainly not exclusively black music by that point. And I'm not sure how far back you have to go to, like John Sinclair, who's a bluesologist and a jazzologist, has very definite opinions about how it's very definitely was black music that was stolen by white people and became white music.
What about that?
I don't agree with that.
You don't think so?
He and I have argued about that.
Would we be still playing the minuet? I mean, what is coming out of Europe? What is there coming out of Europe that are... I mean, in Giorgio, you were in the London scene way back in the 50s, 55, you came to London and over, and I mean, weren't they all doing rhythm and blues, and they were sort of trying to copy what was coming out of the Delta and so forth?
The blues, for my generation of Europeans, jazz was a very distant thing, because none of us had ever been to America, none of us had ever seen any of this stuff live, because we were born just before the Second World War, so there was none of that going on during fascism, of course, and as a matter of fact, if you got caught listening to an American or a jazz record, they sent you off. You know?
Really?
Definitely. So it was very underground. But it was when the Americans started arriving in Europe that we started hearing the Voice of America and things like this, and so this music. But the generation before us had been jazz collectors, because jazz was in Europe in the 20s. It came to Europe in the 20s. Actually, as a matter of fact, it kind of reached Europe during the First World War. There was this sort of outfit of drummers and fife players and trombone players from New Orleans, from Harlem actually, I can't remember the name, who showed up in the trenches in France in 1917 or 18 when the Americans joined the Allies in the First World War. Things got left behind there. Somehow people picked up on this music. There were like some really great European jazz musicians, particularly Django Reinhardt, who was a gypsy. You know, Stefan Grappelli was a violin player, and they made serious contributions to the jazz language. But it was mainly, of course, the jazz that came from New Orleans, and attached to that came the blues, and which was perhaps a little bit neglected at the beginning, but in the 30s it started to sort of appear again.
You thought the blues were attached to jazz? Jazz didn't come out of the blues? You don't see that?
Well, jazz came out of a number of things, you know, and it was like you had all the Creole music in New Orleans, you had the march music from the Civil War, you had which was like instrumental music, and then you had the chants that came from the plantations. You had the gospel, you know, which used European melodies, and then you had like a whole class of people in New Orleans at the time who were Creole, you know, who had Western education, like Jelly Roll Morton and those people who played piano.
Sidney
Actually, composed. Sidney Bechet was not. Well, yeah, perhaps he was Creole, but Sidney Bechet was more an instrumentalist. You know? You had people like Jerry Roll Morton, who was a composer, and there's a few others. And at the same time, popular music started, you know, the little dance ditties.
That's why I make a distinction. Jazz is sometimes called, maybe you can set me straight, because I don't know from music very much or anything, but jazz is very often called the American art form. You know, it's an American art form, as jazz is unique. I mean, is jazz in a distinctive class, or is jazz well put into, like, say, the popular music vein when you use that term? Or is it a distinct quality that almost takes on a classical proportion now?
I would say
where does it fit in?
It touches a whole bunch of stuff. I think probably popular music that came from songs, you know, mainly, I mean, they could have been Irish songs, they could Scottish English songs, and that kind of ended up in country and Western music here. The biggest influence was the Irish folklore, and in New Orleans, to an extent, you had more influences of the Latin, the
yeah.
Roman, the Roman, you know, like the French and the Spanish. And
Spanish,
stuff like
yeah.
that. And but you always had ditties and songs, you know, way back. And Gilbert and Sullivan wrote two 3-minute little ditties,
Yeah.
and so. And then you had what was popular music. That was before radio. Popular music was actually distributed through piano rolls that you put, and then through music sheets. And people, the local musicians, would pick up the music sheets, and that's how publishing really started to become big business. You know, that you wouldn't sell records; you would sell the music sheets, and somebody would be waiting in San Francisco in a bar there during the gold rush, waiting for the latest ditties from whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And so there was a sort of the song form actually entered rock and roll, in other words, jazz, less than it did, in fact, become an element of what became rhythm and blues, or, you know, the music in Kansas City in the 30s, you know, like Big Joe, what's his name? I forget the name. Big Joe, who actually was the first one to call to
Big Joe.
Big Joe, wonderful singer. Big Joe Turner,
Okay.
who was one of the singers in Kansas City in the early 30s, who was the first one to actually use the word rock and roll, you know.
He was.
Let the good times roll.
All right, in the 30s?
Except
In the 30s.
Yeah, that's where the kind of thing started. And then you had, like John said, you had jump music afterwards. See, jazz traveled from New Orleans up the Mississippi,
Chicago,
to
Kansas
Memphis,
City.
and so on, and ended up in New York, and ended up also on the West Coast somehow. And then you had various, you know, sort of regional scenes from which very important things came. And I think that the R&B, instrumental R&B with the singer really came from Kansas City first in the 30s. Benny Moten, Count Basie, who was from New Jersey, but was Kansas City was the town, the gas town. It was like the hot town. You know, Kansas City, Missouri, not Kansas. You know.
So that was the first time it was the 30s. It was called rock and roll.
Well, it wasn't called rock and roll.
Called
it was
it,
called like good time music. It was sort of thing. And the actual calling it of rock and roll came not until the 50s with the jockey that you can.
Calling it rock and
Freed
roll,
and
but
those
there were
guys.
probably a lot of people in the 30s who were rocking. But it was, you know, but it wasn't called that.
You go back and listen to those records, like the recordings that they have from Kansas City in the 30s, and it's the music's hot. It's it's the rock and roll of the 30s. It's just as rocking and just as rolling.
Yeah.
John Sinclair makes the distinction that one of the things that he thinks went wrong with rock and roll is that it stopped rolling. It just rocked.
I see. Yeah.
It lost a certain sensuality at some point.
Well, you got a certain thing saying that it came at a certain time, and also that rock and roll, the music rock and roll, let's say as opposed to jazz or say or other kinds of forms of music, and it's a thing of the youth or something. And you got these guys that started out and were bigger than. And Giorgio, in your book, it comes out. Giorgio knew them all. I mean, it seems to be when he was doing his work in London, who was coming on the scene in London that he didn't know and work closely with.
It's a good question.
Amazing question.
It's a good question.
What a life he's led.
It's amazing to me to have discovered Giorgio.
Yeah, absolutely.
When
Giorgio, the hippest guy in New York.
No kidding. One of my favorite records when when I was a teenager.
No, there's a case to be a case can be made for that. A case can be made for that.
Listen, I wouldn't disagree with that at all.
I just was a wanderer, you know, and I really discovered jazz in '44, and there was the Germans were still marching up and down the little town.
Tell Harold that story. I love that story.
What's
with
the story?
the records
Tell me. Tell the audience. What's the story?
No.
All right.
You should buy my book. You should buy my book when it comes out.
Right. When Giorgio's book comes
Rock
out,
Till You Drop.
actually, I tell some of it in my book too.
You do indeed. That's what I was
so we have
learning.
to tell. But Giorgio was there, you know, at the start of
the
London scene, the R&B, which what they called R&B, which later was developed in what was called rock, and was there when the Rolling Stones were teenagers imitating their favorite blues and R&B performers from America.
Right. That's what they were.
That was it was. It was a tribute. You see, all of that was really a tribute to the underdog somehow. You know, we found the generations in England in the 50s. It was a miserable time.
Yeah.
The English won the war and lost the peace. It was like, you know, I mean, meat was still rationed when they got there. Wow. And it was like
you see the movie
sad.
The Private Function? That's a really funny movie with Michael Palin about the situation in England after the war. Private Function.
No, I didn't see that.
It's a movie. It's a funny movie.
But it was, you know, it was like you never had guessed that the kind of lifestyle changes that came about through a youth culture would actually happen in England. Because England was like asleep. And yet, you know, it was two things that actually brought about this change there. One is the coffee machine.
Yeah.
Strangely enough.
Coffee coming up
the
from
coffee
Morocco.
machine.
Yeah.
No. The coffee machine coming from Italy, the
Oh,
espresso.
the espresso, yeah, right.
Yes, because the English don't drink coffee,
Right.
they drink tea.
Yeah,
That one,
you're
and
right.
the Lambretta, the Vespa. So two Italian inventions
Yeah.
actually brought about swinging London. You know, the Lambretta because it allowed the young people to be more mobile
Yeah, sure.
and to stay out later
I
because
went around
the
Europe one
buses.
summer on a Vespa. Yeah.
Because the London transportation system was shut down at midnight.
Yeah.
Really,
It's
yeah.
the underground, those
Pubs
highways.
closed at ungodly
There were
early
no
hours.
pubs.
Yeah.
There were
No
no clubs.
pubs. He was saying the
Pubs.
pubs closed.
Pubs
Oh,
early.
the pubs closed at
Yeah.
9:30.
Yeah.
man.
So how
And I
can you have a
got-
nightlife?
No, not like
Yeah.
that.
No.
So when I got there in '55, I said, "This is terrible. This is really terrible." So I convinced
Having
him.
come from the continent.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Paris.
I mean, you're 20 years old. You want
Yeah.
to be up all night,
Sure,
discuss,
you wanna go out
get
and
laid,
kick up your heels.
you know, whatever. And,
Rock and roll.
Rock and
That's
roll.
it. And so there was nothing like that. So I convinced this Greek friend of mine who was running the tea bar, the linguist club. Where I was sort
The
of
linguist
teaching,
club.
I was sort of teaching languages there, a conversation. As the way of making a living, and I convinced him to look into this Italian coffee machine because nobody ever knew about it. And I remember when it was expensive, but when the famous machine, the Faema machine, came, everybody was around it. You could have coffee in England, but it was the worst.
Awful. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So he started a little thing called the Olympic Coffee Bar,
Yeah.
just off the King's Road, which
That's
is also
near
the pressed
Piccadilly?
area. No,
No.
King's Road,
Oh,
in
okay.
Chelsea.
Okay,
In London, Chelsea. Just a block away from Sloane Square, which is like where the King's Road starts and it goes down. And the King's Road had been an artist district before the war, there
Right.
were various things. But it was completely dilapidated. It was practically abandoned. There was no life going on there. And so he started this little coffee bar with 3 tables and 9 chairs and this machine, and it became you could be up all night
What year are you
drinking coffee.
talking? Are you talking 55,
55,
56? Yeah,
56.
you started.
56.
You're
They
the
weren't
one.
doing music in there yet, were they?
No, there was no music, but we had, a bit of a jukebox. And I remember, we had one of these, not the rewindable ones, but very primitive record player. We played, he played Greek music.
Yeah.
People could bring in their records and play their records, and that's how it happened. And a lot of the guys that ended up being like, they had the guys that you don't know about here yet, but that's beginning to be published in England, of all kinds of guys that were running illegal gambling operations, chemin de fer, chemin. There was a time where Chelsea became very fashionable because of all these illegal gambling parties. And there was kind of an aristocratic youth that was involved with this. And there were people like Mim Scala, who had actually just written a book himself in England. It hasn't probably not come out here. To describe, I was telling you, it was a sort of a band. So all this fit in with what was going on.
Yeah.
And this coffee bar was just at the beginning of the King's Road. So everybody came there after the pubs closed, drank them up, went off gambling, came back, counting their losses or their wins. And so this thing went on all night. There was no legislation to govern.
A club. A club.
No, the coffee bar.
A coffee bar.
There was
you
no
could stay up-
legislation.
And did they start doing music in the coffee bars or something
Well,
like
yeah,
that?
later on, yes. Later on, yes. It became like there was a very famous film with Cliff Richard in England called Espresso Bongo.
Bongo.
Espresso Bongo, which took place in the coffee bar. Because the coffee bar was sort of kind of connected somehow or other with tropicalism.
All
you know what I
right,
mean?
sure.
So
Well, I think
bongos and
Morocco
things like that and
was,
so on.
yeah. Well, that's great. You were there at 55. It was going, and they were borrowing from rhythm and blues, and they had the people and.
Well, the rhythm blues came a little bit later.
That's a little later.
That's like a few years
55
later.
Like
was,
60 or so, right?
Ruby Dora's
That's
day,
60s, 60s,
Yeah.
But rock and roll already had sort of reached England.
Yeah.
The American version of rock and roll with Little Richard and all those people.
Yeah.
They had the first wave had come and gone. And then, of course, there was local imitation. We had people like Tommy Steele and Cliff Richard. Rock and roll, funny enough, wherever it went, there was, it could be in Italy, in Spain, no, perhaps not so much in Spain, Italy, in France, in Denmark,
certainly.
in Germany, there was a local Elvis Presley clone.
All right, yeah.
Who
Johnny Halliday?
Johnny Halliday in France.
Excuse me, when did we date Presley? I mean, when did he first hit
well,
the
there you
scene?
go.
I mean, he was big, and who was he building upon? Who were the people? He borrowed from a lot of Tupelo and all. He borrowed from the black music, and he
Yes.
borrowed. But when did he start?
He becomes
And is that
becomes
a-
nationally known and then internationally known in '56. That's when Hound
56,
Dog
so
comes
that's
out. and all that
56,
stuff.
all right.
But
like 54, I would say.
He's a regional thing by '54.
And what kind of music was disturbing the parents before that? I mean, just those few
There
years
wasn't
before
any.
that, you know? So
you have to go back to
Lawrence Welk.
Yeah, you have to go back to, I guess, like
Yeah,
the
the
post,
20s.
well, in the post-war period, I think when they were doing a lot of boogie-woogie dancing and stuff, I think parents were probably
Jitterbug.
But that was
the
like
jitterbuggy
yeah,
and
but
the
that was from the
Lindy Hop
30s.
and
The
all
Lindy
that.
Hop, that was
Yeah.
from the
That's
30s.
30s.
That's from
right.
Harlem
I
in
know.
the
It
30s.
is.
Okay, so you
There's
have to go
probably
back
a
to
continuity
Bob.
all this,
Yeah.
but we want to get to where John's book begins because
Yeah,
it's rock
yeah,
till you
yeah,
drop.
yeah,
It's not
yeah.
Lindy till you drop. It's not jazz till you
Yeah,
drop. It's
yeah.
rock till you drop.
Yeah.
But this
What
is
is
all
that?
important
Yeah.
background,
Okay, yeah.
and I got some of it in the book. I didn't want
Yeah,
to
you
tell
got a lot
Giorgio's
in there. It's
whole
a great
story because
book.
he's got to tell his whole story someday in his own book.
Oh, yeah.
But the foundations of it is exactly what Giorgio's been talking about. There became a point where there was a youth movement, and you know, and it was distinct. It was different in London and in other cities in England than it was in the United States, and it was different in Paris, and it was different, you know, everywhere else. But there was an identifiable, some sort of an international phenomenon in the '60s that was the youth movement. And
Absolutely.
whether it was inadvertent or not, rock and roll was part of that. It was a communication
Oh,
medium
yeah,
of
it
that.
was, yeah.
As Ellen Willis, the critic Ellen Willis, one of the first and great women rock critics way back when, not to date her, but back in the '60s, she went to Woodstock. So.
I was at Woodstock.
I was at Woodstock.
Yeah,
too. You were.
you were? I was at Woodstock. Yeah, I was there. I saw Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah.
I tried to
yeah.
get there. I
Triangle
couldn't.
Banner.
I kind of didn't want to be there. I had friends who were
Woodstock was
driving
great.
up, and
I was
we
there
just-
for 3 or 4 days.
Yeah, I was there
That
for
was
the
69. That was a magic time. There was an epiphany going on in this planet at that time.
Things were
And
going
it wasn't
on.
only in the music, but the music
Music was a
carrier
piece of it.
called
Music
Big
was
Piece.
a medium for
But there was
communicating
something else
that.
going on. There was
Yes.
something else
Oh,
big
absolutely.
going on. You know, it was a
Absolutely.
magic time for those who didn't have a chance to live in those times or sense it. It was epiphany time. Yeah.
Now, okay, and
Yeah.
but one of the things that was important about it was that it was progressive, it was moving forward, it was
Yeah.
young people expressing themselves
Right.
in their own way. What depresses me about seeing those exact same, there are performers
Yeah.
today,
Uh-huh.
the Who still drags themselves around concert stages today. This is now
They do?
30-odd years later. This
Yeah.
is 32, 33 years later.
Right. All right.
These guys are all 55, 56-year-old men.
Okay,
I
yeah.
suspect a couple of them are wearing wigs.
Yeah. Right.
They're doing songs that they,
Prostheses rock, right?
colostomy rock.
Yeah, colostomy rock, you call it. Yeah. Right.
When the Rolling Stones, when they did what they called the Steel Wheels tour, and
Yeah.
this was a while back now,
Well, the Stones are
1989,
still
I
there,
think.
packing them in.
People started joking that it was the Steel Wheelchairs tour.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah.
But
They still pack them in. People
they
still go. And what does that
it's-
say about
and I don't. If I were the
world?
Stones, I'd probably still be doing it too because they make a lot of money,
Sure.
and they pack gigantic stadiums with people who spend $50, $100, $150 to be in the space.
They had the platters going around for a while. That was
Now,
and those
that's a
groups-
different thing.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go.
No, I'm not.
But the
one of
point being-
I think rock and roll itself, rock and roll music, is a very specific art form.
Okay, good, okay. Yeah.
Specific, maybe it's a specific folk art form, but it's
All
a
right.
specific art form
Okay.
that is different from the R&B of the Platters. The Platters are not, to me, a rock and roll group. They're an R&B vocal group.
I just meant that they were playing way late.
Yeah,
I went
yeah,
to see them
and-
one time, and it was a long time after their popular music.
Were they any good?
I'm not very good critic. 'Cause I like everything.
I think one of the things that happens is
I'm not a-
when we go see people that were making records when we were 15 or 16, and
Yeah.
now we're 45, we're 50, we're 55. We hear them sing those records. I think we fill in a lot
I think,
of
yeah.
nostalgia.
Yeah, a lot of
because
memories
those guys
go
are
over
not
it. Yeah.
sounding the way they did
Yeah.
when that record came
Right,
out.
and that's one of the points of the book.
It's
in
one
a
of the
sense.
points
You got
of my
these
book.
old guys playing it, and why aren't the new guys playing it? Why aren't the new forms? Why isn't it evolving? Why aren't the new
well,
20-year-olds coming up with
there
a new
are.
twist on rock and roll? And rock and roll's still alive and vigorous, is it? Or is it
It's
just
not what it once
aging?
was,
Yeah.
but there are some great. Now, I also think it's completely irrelevant what I think about their music because I'm a
Alright.
50-year-old man. So
Yeah.
what I think about what the music that 20-year-olds are making is completely irrelevant,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Well, what about the argument? What about
but
the
there
argument
are
that
out
20-year-olds aren't making rock and roll anymore? They're
No, they're
doing now hip hop, or they're doing some sort of a new thing that
Yes.
we, being old, can't understand, and we still want to
absolutely
hear
agree.
Harry Lauder. Or something, you know what I'm saying? It's that same old argument,
no,
and they're
it's
just
true.
saying, get with it. Hip hop's where it's at, and rock and roll is gone.
No, I'm not saying that. Hip hop is
but
one of the
people
places.
will say that.
Yes,
Because hip hop's bigger than life.
Hip hop's huge, but
Yeah,
we're talking about.
planetarily. Yeah.
I mean, if you want to talk commercial success,
Yeah.
rock and roll actually has only had some very brief periods where what I consider good rock or good rock and roll has ever been commercially successful. And to me, that's not a criterion worth discussing. I don't care
No,
about them selling zillions of records.
I didn't mean only that. I mean,
Britney
it's a cultural
Spears sells
force.
zillions of
Yeah,
records.
okay,
you know.
I hear you. I
Is
hear
she a
that.
cultural force at this point? I think not, but
okay.
maybe I just don't get it. Maybe I'm a 50-year-old man who just doesn't get it.
Yeah.
You know,
Hip-hop is
I
clearly...
may be a 65-year-old man who doesn't get it. Yeah, yeah.
Hip-hop clearly is a cult. It has been it has had a large impact on youth, which I don't understand. I'm not in the context, so I don't get it. But that I can clearly recognize that something has happened over in the 80s and 90s, and that something was called hip hop and rap music, and it has had a social impact. It's had
absolutely
perhaps a political impact. I don't know, but it's certainly had a social impact.
Well, you know, every new generation rebels against the music of their parents.
Yeah, or the whole zeitgeist.
Prescribed to be so. Yeah. And then when they're looking for a new music, they often find it in unsuspected places. You know? And the identification that the European youth made with blues was for that reason, also for the simple reason that immediately as rock and roll appeared in Europe at any rate, in 54, 55, it got perverted into this local kind of imitation. So it lost its authenticity.
Skiffle music?
No, skiffle was very authentic. Skiffle was a very particular English phenomenon that actually brought about things like the Beatles, because they started off as a skiffle band. Skiffle band was a mix by a man, an English fellow called Chris Barber, who had still has, and is like in the 70s, and he's still playing 5 nights a week. He had a traditional jazz band based on the... Oh, yes, Chris is still playing.
Put out a record not that long ago.
Chris is still playing. He's out there. He's doing his tours. Wonderful. And he
Skiffle
was...
Till You Drop?
No. No, he wasn't.
Skip Till You Drop.
No, it wasn't skiffle. He's very much attached to New Orleans traditional music, which has evolved over the years, but for instance, he didn't have a piano player in his band because he thought that the music has to be played while you march, so you can't march with a piano player. But when he had a piano player, it was John Lewis with the Modern Jazz Quartet.
Wow.
But he was one of the first new generation of English musicians who was allowed to tour America because he had a big hit here, a thing called Petite Fleur. It was the #1 hit. And so he was able to come and visit America and see here and travel around. And he was also a blues collector. And he collected a lot of records. He was very well known as a collector. And among other things, he collected all these obscure records from little regional labels, you know, that were local hits way back in the 20s, 30s, 40s.
Right.
And it was rent party music.
Rent party.
People played with whatever they had, you know, pots and pans and stuff.
Sure.
And he started doing this in his show, because his show, Chris Barber's show, used to last about 3 hours, and it started off with the New Orleans marching music, then he went up to Mississippi, ended up in Chicago and New York, and then jump music, etc. And he started introducing a little section, a 20-minute section of skiffle, what they called skiffle music in that, and it became hugely popular. In England, we had skiffle was never popular here, you know. But that was also based on black music.
Well, we didn't have the goons either.
No, you didn't have the goons. No, the Monty Python or the other.
Yeah, but we're talking about a lot of things. You know, and one of the things is we got this thing. One of the things you were talking about was the blue and the idea of the music being ripped off by, as it were, there's a creative force in the society. Then very often the most creative forces that create a phenomena are not recognized by the marketplace. Absolutely. And that's a very, very consistent theme within the arts. They just get ripped off. A lot of people feel the blacks have gotten ripped off by cover bands or, you know, Pat Boone with white buck shoes or something like that. But they got that thing. And we had at the book party that we had down at, you know, here in New York a while ago, John Sinclair was here. And we got a piece. Maybe we could show it now, right? Yeah. Because John Sinclair, of course, a great, you know, he managed MC5, and he was a White Panther, and he was a poetic,
the White Panther Party.
And believes in rock and roll, believes in revolution, and he's a force that's been out there for a long time. Yeah. And we got him reading a piece. It goes about 5, 6, 7 minutes or so. But it was at a thing, and maybe we could set that up now. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he's talking about the fact that the really creative force, and that might be a general view of the society, is ripped off by the super society, the merchants and the merchandising, and that's a theme that a lot of people feel now. So maybe we can set it up and run it, and then we're coming back, and we're talking with John Strausbaugh, author of, let's show it again, Rock Till You Drop, which is out now just in the stores, and Giorgio Gomelsky. But let's set up that piece with John Sinclair. It runs about 5, 6 minutes, and then we'll come back. Thank you very much. Run the tape now then, please. Thank you.
of the 20th century. Callous fingertips pressed down on the strings of beat-up guitars on small-town street corners and broken down backwoods joints in the darkness of Saturday night. Or on a bright Sunday morning in a ramshackle clapboard church to praise the Lord and give thanks for surviving another back-breaking week in the cotton fields of the Delta. For this was music made as much to escape the rigors of sharecropping and brutal manual labor as to shape a new form of expression through song. And the Delta blues sounded forth out of Mississippi on crude recordings cut in makeshift studios by enterprising white men from the north and sent out on 78 RPM singles from Paramount and OK and Columbia to enter and reshape the lives of people of every description all over the world. The Delta sound ringing all up and down the line like a national steel guitar crammed in some little juke house in the middle of the woods, or the amplified blast of an electric guitar plugged into the wall of a nasty street corner bar on the south side of Chicago. The sound of Mississippi carried up from the Delta to the factories and tenements of the cities of the north, where people could make a living outside the cotton fields and be paid in cash dollars at the end of every week or two and conduct their lives in the ways that they saw fit. Transforming the industrial noise of the urban landscape through amplified harmonicas and pounding pianos and the crashing of drums and the Fender bass, a music of such great power and incredible beauty and depth of emotion, so deeply rooted in the lives of the people that their bitter experience could be shaped into art of the highest possible order that would inform all of popular music for the rest of the century. The white man would reap the fruits of their artistic labors as if they were bowls of cotton in a 9-foot croaker sack. And the music of the Delta would be appropriated and exploited beyond measure by the descendants of the slaveholders and their bankrollers to swell their bulging coffers. And nothing would be returned to the people of the Delta, and their music would be taken away, and they would be left to face the terrible future of life in the ghetto with nothing to sustain them, nothing to carry them through the horrors of modern life, nothing but the watered-down sound of what was once their music, played back at them by white people on every television set in America. Nothing from the billions of dollars of profits to be realized from their creations. Nothing to the creators. Nothing to the people who created them. Not even the dignity of being recognized for the enormity of their contribution to the cultural life of our nation. Nothing to the blues men. Nothing to the blues people. This is what they mean when they talk about the blues. This is what the blues is all about. Bending frogs for steak and watching the motherfucking snake slither off with the very thing you have made.
That's great. That's great. John's too much. Great music there. And that's Giorgio. Giorgio brought that in. Thanks, Giorgio, very much. He's to be credited with that. He's airing tonight. We're taping on the 5th of July. And he's going to air tonight. And I'll tell you, they get some good stuff on him. And from time to time,
Great. We
get
should mention
Johnson
that,
Cliff.
that band that was backing.
Yeah,
it
who was
is,
that?
That's the greatest undiscovered band in the world. They're called the Senders. They're here in New York City.
Good deal.
Great, phenomenal band.
Well, that's one of the phenomena of music. Art often is.
Yeah.
It's the Van Gogh syndrome or something, that you've got the great people that are doing it and they're not recognized because they are buried by the commercial interest. Is that not a theme that's into the popular
Absolutely, yeah.
music?
And it's been with music
and
like
it's
this
such
for
a disgusting
yeah.
thing that the market doesn't really recognize. You know, like Van Gogh never was recognized.
Well,
in his own
correct,
time.
correct. You know.
The market's got, in a capitalist society, the market's got its own rationale for doing things, and discovering great artists, kind of
Not
like
one.
that's hardly one
Not
of its.
art, unless
And if they do
can't
that,
pay.
and then when they find them, they stay with them and they insist. And this is really absolute reality. They're not interested in talent as such.
No.
They're interested in what they can sell.
Yeah, right.
And then they also want the talent that they can sell to be malleable. You know?
Yeah.
And you have
right.
lots of examples of good people who disappeared because they wouldn't
Toe the line.
toe the line.
Toe the line of what the
Exactly.
marketers say they should be doing and so forth. Yeah, right.
The
It's
story
it's
that-
a dynamic.
When Giorgio talks about the piano rolls, I mean, all that's happened with the technology is that the technology has advanced, but pop performers like the Britney Spearses and Christina Aguileras and stuff of the world are, in effect, they've become their own piano rolls. They're they're infinitely reproducible, little segments of themselves that have been crafted by a manager and a producer and somebody who wrote the songs for them and the band that played the songs behind them. There's very little creativity in that aspect of
Yeah, the creativity is what you're interested in. In fact, moving things ahead and so forth. And the artist, who was it? Was it Auden who said the artist is the antenna of the race? I think it was he. Not sure, it was Pond maybe.
Plato said that when the music changes, the city walls begin to crumble.
Sorry.
And
Yeah,
Plato in the
Jericho
Republic.
said something
Yeah,
about that too.
Of course, he was
Republic.
against change. He didn't.
He was
he
against
didn't
change.
change, yeah.
Right,
So he was
right.
worried
But
about
the thing
the
is, there were-
danger involved
in
in
music.
The Chinese warn against living about interesting times, and we live in interesting times. We live in times where the exponential change is coming upon exponential. I mean, the music is a part of that, but it's also precursor to, or is in touch with, the art is in touch with broader developments that are going on in physics and in technology and all kinds of things. And we do live at a time of some sort of qualitative transformation, do you think?
Well,
now,
hopefully,
in terms of the human
hopefully.
condition?
You know, what you're saying about the prophetic nature of art or
Yeah.
music in particular is the subject matter of a book by Jacques Attali, who was
Yeah.
for many
Oh,
years
yeah,
Mitterrand's
technology.
right-hand man, ended up being the director of the European Development Bank, but got fired.
He wrote
But he
on
wrote this
technology.
book called Bruit, which is noise,
Mm.
and he wrote this in the mid-70s, which when it makes a political economic study of music
Yeah.
in our Western civilization. It's a very interesting book. And it does say that music that does seem to have prophetic announces changes in social organization.
Music and art. Music as part
Yeah.
of the artistic expression of the
Yeah,
human...
but music
He was
particularly.
specifically talking about music.
Oh,
You mean because it's abstract, you see, it's
Yeah.
not, you know what I mean?
Okay.
It's more difficult to analyze a piece of music from a political point of view than it is to, to judge a film that's critical of society or a painting that's a caricature of the prime minister or whatever, you know.
Yeah, I
So
see,
music
yeah.
is difficult to what's the references with music? The dark sounds are the kind of ominous sound, the light sounds, bubbly sounds are the kind of joyful sounds. No, it's more difficult. So
Yeah.
there is a content there in music, a structural content in music that has a wider implication in terms of organization.
Yeah, we don't want to get too far from the book.
No, but that's a point about the book. I mean, that's a point I make in the book, that
Yeah.
you could argue that, in fact, that the more specifically political the content is in music, the less chance it has of actually affecting much political change in the world. It becomes too obvious, I think. And music has to work a little more subtly. It has to be a little more evasive and more evocative.
Yeah, and you get that thing, sometimes they don't know. Who was it, Peter Townsend kicked Abbie Hoffman off the stage?
Knocked him off the
Woodstock?
stage. I
Knocked
saw
her
him. You
off
were
the
there.
stage?
I saw him do it.
Knocked her
I
off
did
the
not
stage
know what
because
was
that
going on at the
That was
time.
the political thing, you know, they don't want the political thing. The music is that. What about that idea that some people say art should be for art's sake, you know, and that other people say that you have to be tuned into the zeitgeist, you have to be tuned into the political realities we had in 1960. They thought it was Vietnam. It may be there's a larger kind of evolution of consciousness that's going on that the young people or the artists were picking up on, and there was liaison between the artist leaders in a certain aesthetic sense or something, and the mass that was worrying to a great number of people within the society. But do you understand what I'm saying? That kind of thing.
Clearly.
And is there a role for that in terms of
Sure there is,
a guiding principle by which the planet's going to be operated in real terms other than just, you know, useful energy or something?
Sure, but you know, but the merchants they'll go along for a certain while because they can sell rebellion to the kids. In other words, they're doing stuff now on MTV that I was flabbergasted when it's now they do their marketing and their research as to what to sell to these kids.
Oh, yeah.
They go and visit the kids in their homes.
I know.
You know, there's the whole
See
stroking going
Rushkoff's
on.
piece on that?
Unbelievable.
Douglas Rushkoff did a great piece on that.
Unbelievable. It's really unbelievable. You know, so
Disgusting.
See, and who's doing that? That's my generation. That's guys in their 40s and 50s who grew up, you know, when we were being rebellious, you know, in the 60s and 70s, and then we all got jobs as newspaper editors or as ad men.
We all got co-opted?
We co-opted ourselves.
Is that a thing? Yeah.
You know, you could.
didn't get
Don
the-
says, you know, you just grew up. You grew up and you got a
But
job
that's
and you
what
wanted
the
to
old
raise
guys
a
are
kid.
always saying. You will
But-
grow up. If you're young and you're conservative, you're something wrong with you. You should be liberal.
Yeah.
If you're old and you're hard, there's something wrong with you. And they
Right.
always say you'll just conserve. You'll
And
mellow.
maybe that's
forth.
all it is,
The
because we
times will be
certainly-
like that kind of thing.
Yeah,
It goes on forever.
We certainly
And you
corrupted
never see any change.
We co-opted ourselves. Nobody, you know, the man didn't take the rock and roll music away from the rock and rollers. The rock and rollers gave it up. They just handed it to the man and said, "Here,
And there was this
make me
great-
$1 million."
Wasn't it true that in 1969, 70 or something, there was Bobby Dylan saying "Blowing in the Wind" coming off folk song, but there was something stirring
There
in
was
this
something going on.
world about
Of course there was. Yes,
liberation
there was.
or
Absolutely.
revolution in the real sense, and somehow it's been squandered or lost or
Yes.
something,
Yes.
and it's
That's-
still there.
Thank you. That's
Well,
one
Do you
of the
think
points of my
that's
book.
something
I
that's
think
part
it's
of the rock and
absolutely
roll
true.
thing? Maybe they go back to the rock and roll roots because there isn't anything new coming up with that other than
Although once again,
co-option rock. You know?
I think rap and hip hop have had a large, probably not a political impact, but a fairly large social impact,
You think,
and a
yeah?
kind of rebellious. Yes, I think that those kids have definitely been rebelling against what was the status quo that they were growing up in, and I think that's a great thing.
Is that where the rebellion is coming now? Is in the hip hop and
I
rock
think-
against?
Well, it has been
we used to
now.
call
Has been,
Rage
I don't
Against
know.
Over the
the-
last 20 years now, I think that's kind of gone.
It's been
now
co-opted? Yeah.
it's the pop music of the 21st century.
Yeah.
Now.
Re-
So
yeah.
so I don't know where the next.
because you have to make
So
an
pop
yeah.
music is distinguished from
Well,
those things
yeah,
that
absolutely.
You
are
have to
going
make a
rage
bit of a
against the
distinction between
Absolutely.
pop music as such and
Yeah.
any other styles
Thank you,
that
yeah.
recuperates.
Yeah.
I mean, rock and roll was popular, if you right, but it wasn't the pop music.
Pop music.
No, it was on the side of the revolution. Or of revolutionary
as white
change.
bands saw it, definitely.
Yeah.
It was the sign of the underdog, and it's kind of dispossessed.
Yeah.
And in England, youth considered themselves dispossessed, so they took on the music of the dispossessed to express themselves. That's how the Rolling Stones and all the bands actually started in England.
Right.
But then they got into the business, you know, and the merchants came on. By the end of the 60s, the merchants dominated the rock and roll scene. So and they wanted to turn it into popular music because that's what they sell. You know?
That's where they can make
and
a
that's
buck.
how they ended up now I was going to say 2001. 2001. And they end up right where they started off in the 30s. You're now back to the Britney Spears and all this kind of stuff. They're turning everything into pop song, to pop music that they can put on the radio, put on MTV, and sell.
So
But
what
you know
about?
what?
Go ahead.
I'm sure there are rebellious youth out there right now making something that I just don't know what it is. And it may not be music. Maybe music is not the medium through which the rebellious youth are communicating with one another.
Right?
Well,
It might be hacking. It might well be, maybe they're computer hackers.
Yeah,
maybe.
the computer things are coming
I don't
out.
know. And I probably shouldn't know.
Yeah, there are all
they're
these things.
supposed to know.
Well, we're leaving in a time with 200,000 years of human experience. Apparently, we come around 200,000 years ago that Homo sapiens appeared, and we come 10,000 generations now. And my mother, I just said to her, she ran a race by running an egg and getting back first, and she got to get a ride in one of these new automobiles. I mean, everything is going so fast, and it's exponential upon exponential now. So the question is there something about these times now? I mean, you could have lived in the 6th century, 200 years to invent a nail, and now it's moving so quickly. Is there something about these times that are radical in the sense that there's some big something change? Call it liberation, freedom from wage slavery, freedom from a lot of the traditions that is blowing in the wind now, and that we have the technological or the augmented capability of. Is there something about these times that makes it different in a qualitative way from the historical pattern out of which we're emerging?
Really, I mean, it's hopeful. You know, in other words,
that would be hopeful.
The invention of tools.
The
invention of tools has made it possible for people to, you know, to build things for themselves. You know, to construct things for themselves. And this is what's happening. The computer is the ultimate democratizer of toolery. You know, if you can play around with language.
Yeah, it's great.
You know,
it's a big.
it allows you to read in a sense. But now, when it comes to this, even though it comes to distribution, but there's always those forces that want to control everything, that will sneak in there and kind of take over. Now, one of the biggest problems on computer network situation is security. You know, the invasion of privacy, etc., etc. So as you advance one step, you sort of disadvance, if you like, in the other, and fundamentally the confrontation is always the same, you know, between the ones that have and the ones that have not, and between the slaves and the slave owners, in the Grecian sense, in the American sense, and so on. So now the question is really, what are the solutions? And this is what I'm a big admirer of yours, Harold, for pushing and distributing this information in regards to Louis Kelso's work.
Oh, well, that's an idea. That's a big idea
because
that could have a real transformative idea.
It seems that after the confrontation between capitalism, socialism, and the disappearance of the socialist argument, it's time now to really have another look at capitalism. And this is very clearly what is happening.
Well, it would be in a larger sense that we were developing all this technologically augmented capability and knowledge base. I mean, we just got the genome. We got all of these things. We have this knowledge base. We have a capability that is Promethean. Archer Daniel Midland every night tells us on the news hour with David Brinkley advertises that we can provide food. We can, even with good design and ecological stuff and the way of Fuller presented and that sort of thing, we have this capability that we didn't have historically to provide for everyone. We don't have a system that lets us do what we're capable of doing. It's economics, it seems. And the traditional economics, Schumpeter, Keynes, or the thing, and the thing that informs the political, there's a new economics needed, and it seems to me that it would let us do what this design capability that evolved.
And one that goes towards cooperation.
That says that we are at a time of awakening on a planetary scale, and that's sort of free-floating angst is there in people, but you don't have a we don't have an expression of it, but the music isn't. I think we were crossing that line back about 1970. Buckminster Fuller said we were transiting from a situation where we've had always a condition of scarcity to where we were transcending with the technological augmentation, the ontologic reality, that we had a capability of providing life support for everyone. that we were actually transcending scarcity as an ontologic reality. And we crossed that line to where there were more than 50% of the world population could be provided for at a growing standard of living in 1970. That's what he had 1970 pegged.
Still,
there was something blowing in the wind there, but we haven't picked up.
And
We've
Orwell
gone
had
back into the old patterns have been reified.
Orwell had 1984 pegged.
Right.
And when he came and went, everybody said, oh, we're out of that trouble, we're out of trouble. And now, all of a sudden, you know, this rate of speakies, you know, this kind of like, this double meaning of language, even in political language in terms of democracy. You saw what happened here in your country with regards to the next presidential election. This and the invasion of privacy, the control of the profiling the customer to suit.
You see the thing down in Tampa now. They got the
the security cams. And you know,
face recognition.
I think when Bucky was talking about ontologically, we have gotten to the point where we don't, where we can
provide for
everyone. But I think the political realities are still quite clearly that there are a lot of forces in the world that want to manufacture shortcomings and want to manufacture scarcity for a lot of good political reasons.
Yeah, and certainly for political reasons. The political system is always behind the antenna of the race, the artist.
For commercial reasons.
For commercial reasons.
Scarcity
is the allocation of scarce resources. I mean, the more scarce it is, the more value it has, and that sort of thing. So you've got, but if you're coming to a time where you're really transcending against 200,000 years of human history, a condition in which all human institutions have evolved, and you're coming to a new kind of capability, there's going to be a lot of resistance to that. All the architecture of all your institutions are predicated in an ontologic situation that is being transformed in a larger context.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it still doesn't take away from the fact that that's happening, and the angst that is being felt within the human soul and expressed through the artistic expression is one that is saying, is crying out for. James Joyce had Daedalus say, history is a nightmare from which I'm attempting to awaken. And are we awakening, and is the music a thing to a large-scale awakening, or is it just another way to sell a bunch of records or get off some youthful energy?
In the ideal sense, music should be an awakening force. You know, art should be an awakening force, obviously. But who controls it? You know, and how much awakening is necessary?
Well, it would be, if that kind of a thing is at hand, it would seem to me, if there is such a thing, and you've got a thing, we had the old dialectic wherein if you're going to provide, if you're going to say there's a change, you've got the thesis and antithesis. You got the good guy, the bad guys, and the good guy, and everything's going to be fine as long as we cut off your head. But if you're really transcending scarcity, as he said, I mean, the thing is that you'd be able to provide those intellectual forces for transformation and liberation and involvement of the masses of the people that have been oppressed and so forth, involving them in a way that's, and the ecology, involving them, but in a way that could be understood and gone along with by those who have objections to the idea that there be this change. And that's where I think the Lewis Kelso thing comes in, because it's a system of economics that would have to be ultimately understood by and be able to be gone along by the people responsible for the historically inherited institutions. But is do you understand? It's sort of a thing like it's a well, I don't know. The art would be a sort of.
I understand, but no, it's music is very much the same, Harold.
Yes, exactly.
You know, in the sense like what do the record companies want? The record companies want something like the Beatles, right? But can't do that.
Right.
So what they want is something they can sell. So it has to sound like something that is already existing.
Okay, so it's not going to. So the impetus that's not going to come out of those circles. It's not going to come out of those circles. Like we were talking to you, John. We're in Access here, and the one charge you have, just say, and we have it in the internet to certain things. The one charge we have in Access here is we can come and make a program. We can put it on to a considerable number of people in New York. Giorgio does, puts on great John Sinclair, and great stuff and everything. And the one rule that they have there, the one thing they monitor against is, thou shalt not make a buck.
Money.
So this is a realm, and there are other realms within the society where the profit motive and the market forces are being, in a certain sense, countered. So it would be to those places that one would tend to go to look for the precursors of the real, you know, and there's others within the internet, non-commercial oriented aspects of the internet. So even though the marketers are running this particular society, the answers won't come from there any more than they would come from the king who's in the head of the system that's running things.
Right.
It will come from someplace else, like here or like New York Press. Isn't New York Press a giveaway?
Yeah.
All right. So that those circles could expand, and that's where one would look for the real
I see the
sophisticated answers to what, in an ontologic sense, the universe cries out for.
If you're not trying to get people to buy it, then you're free to say
That's
anything
right.
you want to
There's
say.
a tremendous freedom in
and
there.
it makes a big difference.
If you can set up an
a
economic
paper that we like to read, so I mean, and people don't want to read it, it was free. So
but it runs
fine.
counter to the zeitgeist, because nowadays nothing has any value if it doesn't
free.
have a market value in the mind of the population.
Clearly,
And that's the only, you understand? But that's something that should be questioned in and of itself as a principle. People are insecure because they don't have economic security, perhaps, or whatever. You know.
I think that's quite true. And the larger system is, I think, is very good at sequestering and corralling impulses like access TV or free publications. You know, it's very nice of them to support it, but it's also, support is another way to kind of keep your eye on things. And
Well,
keep
perhaps,
control
but
of
I
things.
think we should maybe do well not to blame them in a certain sense, but to look at the intellectual community that we did not come up with an alternative.
No, it's true.
That was outside of a dialectic that's going to cut off their heads. You have to come up with an understanding of what's going on in a comprehensive way.
That's absolutely true.
Is one that transcends the need of having some enemy that's going to be, you know, it's the challenge of those who are on the side of change, and it's responsible. I mean, it's appropriate that if you're going to have a real change and not some little revolutionary something within the dialectic that's going on historically, there better be some guys who are making sure that that traditional system that's in place is not going to be overthrown in some anarchistic thing where the lights all go out. There's somebody has to be, and it's appropriate, but you should be able to have a system that can engage them ultimately.
Yeah, but you know, change
Do you
is
understand what I'm
fearful.
saying? A big change, not
is
a little
fearful
change.
to these people. They know, you know, it's like when you're in an army or anything like this. You know, you have a regimentation, you have a structural organization of things, all the way down. That comes from like perhaps 400 or 500 years.
Sure, and you got all those wage
of,
slaves running around doing
right.
things you want them to do.
And hence, you know, for them to consider change is fearful.
Of course.
One
But it doesn't have to be fearful for us. It doesn't have to be fearful for those who want the change to have, but to have something that's going to involve them.
Right. Then how do you engage
Well, that's
the
where I
masses?
think the Lewis
at that
Kelso
point?
might be a really important kind of
but how do you
view
engage
of,
the masses in this kind of stuff? The Manhattan public access is fine, but it's seen by 700,000 or whatever.
Well, it could link up. They're starting to stream. They're starting to stream. They're starting to stream it out.
Sure.
And then what they should do is also get some
Absolutely.
people from the
You're far from being
establishment in
able to
public
compete
access.
with even Channel 13 or with not to mention CNN or anything in terms of the coverage they have. You know, one 30-second spot on CNN reaches the world.
I'm
you
here.
know?
I understand.
It would take 30 years of
Well,
public access to.
yeah, but realize, John, we're now streaming, so we reach the world. It's beginning to streaming it. I had a friend pick up my program in Russia. He saw it in Russia. I mean, so that's the beginning. But anyway, I didn't mean to get... John, I wanted to congratulate you. We hardly got a chance to talk about it, but I want to show everyone. We're sorry we run out of time, but here it is, folks. In the bookstores now, Rock Till You Drop, and it's written by John Strausbaugh, who is our guest. We got off on a lot of subjects. I think these things all do relate.
I think it all comes
and so
together.
forth. And your pleasure to have his perceptions, and of course Giorgio Gomelsky, the hippest man in New York City, I will say, and an incredible amount of information about that early work with the Rolling Stones and all the big Beatles and so forth in London that was part of his life. And thank you very much for coming and talking about this subject. We on Conversations invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week on Conversations. That's it for now. John, once again, thank you very much. And Giorgio, thanks very much indeed. Until next week. Sorry, we ran out of time.
No, it was
we're
great.
still running,
That
so
was
the
fun.
graphics or the credits is running now. So.
Yeah, it's fun. That's really fun.
But it's a big thing. The thing I gave you is that, well, I know it's very esoteric and it's hard because, you know, you got all this, it's economics, I think. You just need an economic.
The dismal science, right?
Well,
more incomprehensible.
It's not Keynes, and it's not Schumpeter, and it's not Van Hayek, and it's not what informs George Bush or the political. It's something new. There's something new outside of the left wing, right wing, you know, gradations that they have. There's something new that's needed, and this is the only thing I see new.
But you need someone that picks that up somehow. You know, imagine like if you had, in fact, you know, those people that say that we have the technology to solve. You know,
yeah, all you need is a system that lets it turn it on.
That's it.
Yeah.
All you really need
is
a model. Create a model